I'm VJ Hamilton and welcome to the Autoimmune RESET, the place for you to learn how to thrive with autoimmune disease and feel empowered to take steps to transform your health to feel better than ever. You can start making changes today to improve your health. So with every episode, my mission is to share with you simple ways to up-level your diet and lifestyle with key learnings from my own journey reversing autoimmune disease and inspirational stories from those who have reset their autoimmune symptoms and are now thriving in life. I suffered from autoimmune disease for over 25 years and now I live symptom-free, and I wish the same for you as well. So thank you for being here and sharing this time with me. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Autoimmune RESET podcast. I'm your host, VJ Hamilton. I'm a nutritionist, scientist and expert in autoimmune disease. And today we're going to be focusing on multiple sclerosis and in particular the effects that foods can have on the development of the condition. And there was a study that was published recently looking at the connection between dairy and multiple sclerosis, and we will be going into that in more detail later on in this episode. And we will also be looking at some key nutrient deficiencies when it comes to multiple sclerosis. As you may know if you've been listening to the podcast before, my brother has multiple sclerosis and he got diagnosed quite some time ago now. It must have been at least 20 years, well, not quite 20 years. It's coming up to 20 years, I think, when he got diagnosed. And I wasn't a nutritionist at the time when he got diagnosed, but I had studied autoimmune disease at university and I became obsessed at looking at the research around multiple sclerosis, and I became fascinated by the link with vitamin B12 and the similarities between a vitamin B12 deficiency and multiple sclerosis. So we're going to be talking about that as well, and talking about some other food sensitivities that are linked to multiple sclerosis. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's start with a quick overview of what multiple sclerosis is. So multiple sclerosis is a chronic autoimmune disease that affects the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. And in MS, the immune system mistakenly attacks the myelin sheath, which is a protective layer around nerve fibres. And we need our nerves because they send messages to our muscles and to different systems in the body so that they work effectively. So you think about the myelin sheath as this insulation around electrical waves. It helps to transmit nerve signals efficiently. And when this sheath is damaged, it can slow down or block the transmission of these signals, leading to a range of symptoms. And there are so many symptoms linked to multiple sclerosis, but these can range from fatigue, muscle weakness, balance issues and cognitive changes. And when my brother was first diagnosed, his first symptom, well, he likely had symptoms before his diagnosis, but this was the symptom that led him to the MS diagnosis, was that he woke up and his whole left arm was numb and he couldn't move it. And this was around Christmas time and we just had no idea what it was. And he went to see a chiropractor to see if they would be able to help, and they said that he should go and get it checked out with a doctor, which he did do. So there are lots of different symptoms that relate to MS. When you are in a flare, you may have more severe symptoms, and it really depends on the type of multiple sclerosis that you have, because you can have a progressive type of multiple sclerosis, and you can also have the relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which is where you go from flare to flare, which then can lead to the progressing type of multiple sclerosis, but not always. I have worked with many clients with multiple sclerosis, and they will often say the same thing to me, that it took them a long time to get diagnosed, especially my female clients for some reason. And they have lived with numbness and tinglingness and brain fog and fatigue for many years before getting diagnosed. And that's because MS symptoms MS itself can be quite tricky to diagnose, because the symptoms of MS can mimic other conditions. So to get diagnosed, the way that the process works from a conventional medicine perspective is that they will do a combination of neurological exams. You will have an MRI scan, and that's looking for lesions on the brain and spinal cord, which is a hallmark for MS. And then they will sometimes do a lumbar puncture to analyse the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, in the context of MS, the reason they are doing that lumbar puncture is to detect things called oligoclonal bands. And these oligoclonal bands are one of the main reasons that they will do a lumbar puncture, because they want to check for this, because when you have MS, there are specific proteins that are found in the cerebrospinal fluid, and they are antibodies which indicate that there is inflammation in the central nervous system. And the presence of these bands will support the diagnosis for MS. And they're going to be taking in the neurological exam and the MRI scans as well. But sometimes they will go a step further and do this lumbar puncture so that they know that it is MS. But as you can see, this isn't a straightforward diagnosis process. There isn't one thing that they will check to diagnose you with. It's a factor of different things which lead them to the conclusion that you have multiple sclerosis. The other thing that the lumbar puncture might detect is elevated white blood cells in the central nervous system, and that can of course indicate an inflammatory process which you see in multiple sclerosis. And the lumbar puncture can also be helpful because there are certain infections or other autoimmune disorders or even cancer that can mimic MS. And by analysing the cerebrospinal fluid, then they can either detect the presence of a bacteria, virus, or abnormal cells, which will lead them to a different diagnosis, or they can rule that out and then you will be diagnosed with multiple sclerosis if your doctor thinks that that's what you have. So this process can take a lot of time. And I always found this fascinating when I started studying autoimmune disease at university, and I realised that there wasn't a specific way of diagnosing a lot of these conditions. Even if you have autoantibodies present in the blood, that isn't the way that they will diagnose these conditions, because a lot of people will have autoantibodies and will never go on to develop an autoimmune condition. So they have to use multiple factors to diagnose you with a condition, and they are diagnosing you based on the presentation of that condition, the way that it is affecting your body. And it's very straightforward when it's something like alopecia, especially something like alopecia areata, and there is that patchy hair loss, and they know that alopecia areata presents in that way. But with multiple sclerosis, because there are so many symptoms, it is a lot harder. Now, there is a test that is run by functional medicine practitioners and nutritionists like myself, and it's called the Cyrix Arrow 5. This test specifically looks at antibodies against various components of the nervous system, including the myelin sheath. And the test is designed to help identify autoimmune reactivity, particularly against myelin, but other proteins or neural antigens which are in the brain. And it can be quite helpful to do this test, especially if you suspect that you might have multiple sclerosis and you're going through that diagnosis process, or you may have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and it is worth checking this and to see whether it is a factor, because it is going to tell you whether you have those antibodies present. And as I said earlier, just because you've got the antibodies doesn't mean that you definitely have a condition, but it's just another piece of the puzzle, and bringing that all together is going to help you understand what condition you have and how it's affecting you. And the test run by Cyrex will detect antibodies against myelin basic protein, which is the antigen that can be affected in multiple sclerosis. But as I said, it also tests for other neural antigens, and it can help to understand whether you have susceptibility to other neurodegenerative conditions as well. So if you would like to find out more about that test, feel free to contact me. You can send me a direct message over on my Instagram account, which is at the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. So as you can see, it is not clear-cut in diagnosing multiple sclerosis. You have lots of different tests that you can do, but bringing it all together is when you will finally get a diagnosis. Now, if you're at the point that you have a multiple sclerosis diagnosis, where do you go from here? Where do you start with your diet? And there are some set protocols that have been written in certain books that I know people can follow and see really good results with these types of protocols. For example, the Walls protocol is something that is very popular. But the truth is, everyone is going to be different. And the reason that somebody has got multiple sclerosis will be different dependent on who they are, dependent on their genetics, their environment, their upbringing, the food that they're eating, their gut microbiome. It is interesting that there is this link with particular food sensitivities, and there was some recent research looking into the antigens in dairy specifically, and this was published in Frontiers in Immunology, and it showed a potential link between dairy allergies and multiple sclerosis. And the study found that some individuals, so not everyone, but some individuals with MS have an exaggerated immune response to certain proteins found in cow's milk, like casein. And this heightened immune response could potentially trigger or worsen the autoimmune attack on the myelin sheath. So let's look at this study in a bit more detail, because researchers had long suspected that there was a connection between diet, immune responses, and autoimmune diseases like MS. And I've spoken about that in depth in many podcast episodes, and I obviously will look into this for many of my clients as well. But multiple sclerosis, as I said, is a condition where the immune system is attacking the myelin sheath. But what can happen, and what this study found, is that when somebody's immune system is reacting to a protein in cow's milk, and this protein is called butyrophilin, and butyrophilin has a structural similarity to the myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein, which is, we're going to refer to it as MOG. But butyrophilin, which is a component of cow's milk, looks similar to this MOG. And because that is part of the protective cover of the nerve, that myelin that is attacked in multiple sclerosis, what happens when the immune system fires up a response against butyrophilin in cow's milk, it then fires up a response against this MOG, which is a component of myelin. And this mechanism is called molecular mimicry, and there have been many studies looking at molecular mimicry when it comes to autoimmune disease, but not specifically when it comes to multiple sclerosis and this particular component of milk, which is butyrophilin. But they have now shown that there is this link between them, and there is this cross reactivity, which means that if you have multiple sclerosis and you are drinking milk every day, you are firing up not just an immune reaction to the milk itself, and that can cause other issues in the body, but you're also having this cross reactivity, and it means that your myelin is continuing to be damaged. And myelin repairs itself and you create new myelin, but when it comes to that constant attack by the immune system on the myelin sheath, this could be happening if you are drinking milk every day. And what the study observed was that some individuals with MS had elevated levels of antibodies against both butyrophilin and MOG. And that's where the conclusion of the study comes from, because if you have elevated antibodies to both of those things, it does suggest that there is this immune response that is being triggered against cow's milk. So it's really encouraging study, because it means for some individuals, particularly those who are genetically predisposed to MS, that consuming cow's milk might increase the risk of developing MS or exacerbating its progression. And by taking milk out the diet, it can mean that you are not creating that inflammatory response against myelin anymore, and you can focus more on recovery and creating new myelin. And there have been studies around lion's mane mushrooms which can help to remyelinate your nerves and to help to recover the damage that has been done from the immune system. So that's maybe something that you can look into. But it's a great study. It opens up a lot of possibility for dietary interventions when it comes to MS, and for those who may be drinking a lot of milk or consuming a lot of dairy and are having MS symptoms, then it may be worthwhile to take milk out the diet and see if it improves your symptoms. But if you're already dairy free and you are not seeing results, then it is likely something else, because as I said, it's only for some people who are genetically susceptible to that. And we need to be mindful when it comes to any study that this study provides compelling evidence for a potential link between cow's milk and MS, but it does not prove causation. So it's always worth bearing these studies in mind and seeing whether this resonates for you, because I know that when I was growing up, my brother would consume a pint of milk every day, and he would have it on his cereal, and he had a lot of milk and he loves milk. And often we like to consume things that stimulate us in some way, and what can happen when you have a food sensitivity is you can be having that stimulation, which is why you crave it. And I can definitely see the link with my brother, but he loves milk and he wants to consume milk. But I think this is quite an easy dietary intervention that you can make and see a lot of progress with it. And I have been dairy free for many years of my life, and I am now able to consume a little bit of dairy without symptoms, because the main symptom that I would see from consuming dairy was psoriasis. So it's quite an obvious reaction when I would have dairy, and now I know I can have a little bit of feta cheese. I might be able to have some yogurt occasionally, but I don't overdo it. I will be having dairy a couple of times a week maximum, because I just don't think that I react that well to it. And now I know more about this link and this study, and the fact that I probably do have a genetic susceptibility to conditions like multiple sclerosis, because it's in my family, and there are other family members that have had neurodegenerative nerve type conditions. So it's just something that I'm always going to be bearing in mind, but it's not going to apply for everyone. But I can certainly see a link when it comes to my brother who has multiple sclerosis, but also I can see the link between my consumption of dairy and some of my symptoms as well. And the good thing that has come out as a conclusion from this study is that not everybody had this reaction, and that's why I think we always need to be a bit wary of these one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to an autoimmune condition, because we are all different, we all have different genetics, and we're all going to be having different reactions to foods. And that's why you need to find what is right for you, whether that is through trial and error, whether it's through testing, whether it's from observing your body and journaling and taking note and making changes that are going to work for you. Or working with a nutritionist like me and really going for it and focusing on your health for 3 months and making those significant and meaningful changes to your health, where you begin to understand your body better, but you also know what dietary interventions or what nutrients or what supplements are working for you and what the underlying root cause is for you. So the study, as I said, it really highlights the importance of the interactions between our diet and the development of conditions like multiple sclerosis. And however, dairy isn't the only potential dietary culprit when it comes to the development of multiple sclerosis. And they have shown that gluten sensitivity, including celiac disease, has also been linked to multiple sclerosis. And as I am sure you're well aware, gluten is a protein which is found in wheat and other grains and can cause an immune response in people with celiac disease that damages the small intestines. But there is also this condition called gluten sensitivity or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where you can still have an immune response to gluten, but you don't get the same damage as you might see with celiac disease. And there is a link between gluten sensitivity and celiac disease and multiple sclerosis. And I expect that is for several reasons, that there's this underlying genetic susceptibility to autoimmune disease, but it could also be the effect that celiac disease and gluten sensitivity has on the immune system and on your gut function. So I can see there are probably multiple links between that. And there may also be molecular mimicry, as there is with dairy proteins, as we have just discussed. So that's where I'm going to leave it when it comes to food sensitivities, because now I want to talk to you about vitamin B12 and how this fits into the picture. Because vitamin B12 is crucial for several functions in the body, including the production of red blood cells and the maintenance of the nervous system. So it plays a particular role in the synthesis and the maintenance of the myelin sheath. So when someone is deficient in B12, it can lead to neurological symptoms that are eerily similar to those in MS, such as numbness, tingling, and cognitive difficulties. And there is one symptom that I noticed in myself and in my brother, which I looked into, and that is something called megaloblastic anemia, and it is due to a vitamin B12 deficiency, and it's when red blood cells become abnormally large and are less effective at carrying oxygen. So let's talk about this condition in a bit more detail, because if you run a full blood count, you will see this come up as a high MCV value. So it's worth looking at that. And the range from a conventional medicine perspective is quite large. So if you are kind of 95 or above, then you're kind of veering into having enlarged red blood cells. And megaloblastic anemia is a type of anemia that occurs when the bone marrow produces unusually large and immature red blood cells called megaloblasts. This condition is often caused by vitamin B12 deficiency, or it can also be caused by a folate deficiency. And these are nutrients that are crucial for DNA synthesis and the proper formation of red blood cells. And that's why this is a symptom of having a deficiency in those nutrients. And you might just think, well, why does this matter? Well, it matters because hypoxia, which is lack of oxygen, is very much linked to multiple sclerosis. And when the red blood cells are enlarged and they're responsible for carrying oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body, when you have enlarged red blood cells, they're too large to be able to effectively carry oxygen around the body, and that can lead to this state of hypoxia. And there is lots of research to link hypoxia to multiple sclerosis. And there was a point in time where I was speaking to a professor at the University College London about studying a PhD, and the PhD was specifically looking at medication for multiple sclerosis. And I decided I just really wanted to work with clients in clinical practice, which is why I went down the nutrition route. But his theory was that multiple sclerosis was just to do with lack of oxygen to parts of the nervous system, and that caused the destruction that you see with those lesions in the spine and the brain, which is a extremely valid theory, and he didn't believe that it was an autoimmune condition. And that's the thing, we need to go back to the fact that these conditions are diagnosed based on their presentation, not by their underlying mechanism. So it could be that some people's multiple sclerosis is autoimmune and others aren't, and it could be more that theirs is linked to hypoxia. But that's why the red blood cells are extremely important, and they can be linked to multiple sclerosis for that reason alone. Because the myelin sheath, of course, insulates and protects the nerve fibres, and they require adequate oxygen and nutrients to maintain their structure and function. And when you are in this state of hypoxia, which leads to insufficient oxygen being supplied to the nerves and to the myelin sheath, that can affect the ability of the cells to maintain and repair the myelin sheath, and over time it can become degraded and dysfunctional, which is a hallmark of MS. So you can see how there is this link. And then if you're in a state of hypoxia, you can end up with neuron damage, because neurons are highly sensitive to oxygen. So chronic hypoxia can lead to neuronal stress and damage and make the nervous system more vulnerable to autoimmune attacks, such as those seen in MS. These are just a few factors to really be considering when it comes to the root cause of your multiple sclerosis. And I'm not always thinking that it's one thing. I will review my clients' questionnaire that they complete. We'll go through their questionnaire responses in a initial consultation, really talk through them all. I'll go through their health history. I'll understand how they react to certain foods, and then I will make a decision of what I think is going to make the most difference to them and what might be at the root of their symptoms. And it might be a vitamin B12 deficiency, it might be a milk allergy, it might be something entirely different, and that is part of functional medicine. And I mean, that's why I enjoy it so much, because I love to learn and I love to investigate these things for each of my clients. But there is more to the story when it comes to vitamin B12, because it is also important for fat metabolism, which is key at maintaining the health of the myelin sheath, because the sheath is made up of largely fats. And if you aren't digesting fats very well, then it means that the body won't have the right building blocks to create that myelin sheath. And without enough vitamin B12, or if the fat digestion is impaired in any way, then that is going to impair the integrity of the myelin, and the myelin could become compromised and might exacerbate or even contribute to the progression of multiple sclerosis. And that is something that is tested for in a stool test. I will look at how well my clients are absorbing and breaking down fats, because it's so vital in many autoimmune conditions, but particularly multiple sclerosis, where the part of the cell or the nerve that is being attacked is fat. So if you're not absorbing and utilizing fats well, it's more likely that myelin isn't going to be as optimal as it could be, and it might have some disorder or dysfunction in it that means that the immune system starts to flare up against it. So if you are listening to this podcast episode today and you have multiple sclerosis and you're thinking, well, what do I do? Where do I start? Well, when I'm working with a client, the first thing I'm going to explore is whether they have any food sensitivities. And there are various ways that you can do that. You can do that through testing, or you can do that through the gold standard, which is an elimination protocol, and see whether you are having any reactions to certain foods. A study that was published in Nutrients found that individuals with gluten sensitivity and MS experienced a reduction in inflammation and an improvement in symptoms when they followed a gluten-free diet. And another therapy that has been studied is vitamin D supplementation. So I would say the next step is looking for any nutrient deficiencies. And if you have multiple sclerosis, the first deficiency I'd be looking at is vitamin D, because the research has shown that vitamin D plays a role in immune regulation, and there have been many studies that have shown that higher vitamin D levels are associated with a lower risk of multiple sclerosis relapses. And that's similar for omega-3 fatty acids that are found in fish oil, which are anti-inflammatory and support brain health, making them a good option when it comes to looking at what nutrients are going to help you the most in that moment of time, especially when you're going through a flare. And vitamin D and omega-3s are definitely the place to start. For vitamin B12, ensuring you have adequate levels is absolutely critical, and there are various ways that you can test for it. Unfortunately, the serum vitamin B12 value doesn't always tell you the true picture of what is going on, and it is better to do a functional B12 test, which is methylmalonic acid, which is going to tell you whether you have a vitamin B12 deficiency at the cellular level, which is the most important when it comes to B12. So just because you have high levels of vitamin B12 in your blood doesn't mean you don't have a deficiency, and there are various reasons why that might be the case, and it's probably worth another podcast episode to discuss that more in detail. But supplementing with B12 can help with symptoms related to nerve damage, and it can support the maintenance of that myelin sheath. And a study showed that B12 supplementation improved neurological function in those who had a deficiency in vitamin B12. And that's the key when it comes to these vitamins. Taking them in high doses, if you don't have a deficiency, isn't going to help. It's when you have a deficiency that they can make the most difference. And unfortunately, when it comes to vitamin B12, it's a little bit more complex than just vitamin B12 itself, especially in the context of neurological issues and conditions like multiple sclerosis, because the type of B12 you choose can make a significant difference. And this is some of the research that I studied in depth. I became completely obsessed and realized that the vitamin B12 supplements that I'd been taking were completely wrong for me. And that was a supplement called cyanocobalamin, and it's worth checking your supplements. If you're taking a multivitamin or you're taking a B complex, have a look what type of vitamin B12 you're taking, because for some people cyanocobalamin might be okay. I don't particularly like it, and it is the type of vitamin B12 that is in foods like spirulina, and that was something I was having a lot of at the time because I was vegetarian when I first started making changes for my health. But when it comes to vitamin B12, the types that you want to be looking for are methylcobalamin and adenosylcobalamin. And it's really adenosylcobalamin, which I would say is the most beneficial when it comes to cases of neurological damage and support for the myelin sheath. Because adenosylcobalamin, which is a type of vitamin B12, it's one of two of the active forms of B12, the other one being methylcobalamin, which is the most popular of the two. But adenosylcobalamin plays a crucial role in cellular energy production and the maintenance of the nervous system. And this active form of B12 helps with the mitochondrial function, which is the powerhouse of the cells. It's the component of the cells that produces energy, and that's extremely important when it comes to a condition like multiple sclerosis, but it helps with the production of energy from fats and protein. So this is what this nutrient can help with. And neurons rely heavily on efficient energy production to maintain the myelin sheath and ensure proper nerve function, which is what you're looking for when it comes to multiple sclerosis. Adenosylcobalamin, which is important for maintaining the integrity of the myelin sheath. It's been shown to help repair and maintain the myelin. So even if there is that continuous destruction of the myelin, which you don't want as much as possible, but if that is happening, you can take adenosylcobalamin to help with the repair process and hopefully help to alleviate symptoms as well. Because that test that I mentioned for vitamin B12, the functional vitamin B12 tests for something called methylmalonic acid. And I know when I was going through all the testing myself, when I first started making changes for my health, it was again a marker that I was obsessed with because it was always high. And methylmalonic acid can become neurotoxic, which can obviously cause issues in the brain. It can cause symptoms like brain fog and anxiety and fatigue, all those symptoms that I was experiencing at the time, but it can cause neurological damage as well. And adenosylcobalamin will help to reduce methylmalonic acid. And that's how I discovered it, because I realized that methylcobalamin wasn't going to have the same effect on methylmalonic acid. And I knew that was where I needed support, which is why I started supplementing with adenosylcobalamin. This was while I was training to be a nutritionist. But it's a form of vitamin B12 that isn't as readily available, but you can find it more now, which is great. So when it comes to supplementing vitamin B12, if you have multiple sclerosis and you have raised methylmalonic acid, then adenosylcobalamin is probably the place to go. However, when it comes to methylation, which is a really important process as well and is crucial for DNA synthesis and detoxification, then you might want to be focusing more on methylcobalamin. As always, it's always best to work with a nutritionist or functional medicine practitioner when it comes to recommending supplements specifically for you, because there are contraindications related to your medication and your condition. So always best to be cautious and safe when it comes to supplements. So we've covered a lot today. We've talked about the link between dairy and gluten sensitivities when it comes to multiple sclerosis and some underlying nutrient deficiencies that are linked to multiple sclerosis. So if you haven't looked into any of these areas before and you have multiple sclerosis, then it's worth looking into these for sure. And if you have symptoms that are similar to symptoms of MS, but you haven't been diagnosed yet, then hopefully this has given you some ideas for things that you can start looking into, and of course work with your doctor to go through that diagnosis process. If you have any symptoms that you think might relate to MS, if you have a family history of autoimmune disease, or if you have any siblings or anyone who is a close relation who has multiple sclerosis, because unfortunately there is a higher risk if you have a family member with multiple sclerosis. And lastly, I just wanted to tell you about the Great North Run. So at the minute I am training for the Great North Run to support my brother and to support the MS Society, and I am going to put the link to my story and my brother's story in the show notes if you would like to hear more about that. And obviously there is no obligation, but I would love your support. I am certainly not a runner. I enjoy running, and I enjoy running 5k, but I have never done long distance running. I developed chronic fatigue syndrome as a teenager, and I was never able to run long distance when I was at that age. And then I went through my 20s with chronic fatigue syndrome and was recovering really in my 30s. And now in my early 40s, I've decided to do a half marathon to support multiple sclerosis for my brother and for everyone who is going through this condition, because I know with more research we can find more answers. And one of the things that I was determined to do when my brother was diagnosed with MS is that I was going to find a cure for MS, and it was quite an ambitious goal, but I would still love to get there, or I'd still like to support researchers and people who are finding medications and therapies and hopefully natural approaches that can really make a difference. And I've worked with clients with multiple sclerosis, and they have seen a huge transformation by just making some dietary changes and making some lifestyle changes as well. That's, a key factor when it comes to any autoimmune disease, including multiple sclerosis. So I'm going to be training. I've been looking after myself. I'm going out and doing an 18k run this weekend, and hopefully I will be okay for the Great North Run. But if you would like to hear a bit more about my story, then you will find the link for that in the show notes. If not, if you have any questions about today's episode, feel free to head over to my Instagram account, which is at the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. You can also join my free group, the Autoimmune Forum, which is a community of strong-willed individuals with autoimmune disease and multiple sclerosis who are learning ways to thrive in life, and it's just a very supportive community. It's a safe space to be and ask questions, and I'd love to see you over there. If not, have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll be in touch soon. Take care. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Autoimmune Reset. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if you liked it, I would hugely appreciate a review on iTunes, as it helps me understand what you like about the podcast and to help share the information with more people. I'm excited to speak to you next time, and remember, you have the power to take the reins on your health. So keep the faith and celebrate the small wins. Until next time.